My name is Martin Kimani. I'm the acting director of the Ansari Africa Center, and we're very glad to have you here with us today. It's an exciting time, I think, for all of us, and I think from what I've seen, a lot of people are trying to figure out what is happening in North Africa and how those events are going to play out in the rest of Africa. So I just have a few short remarks to make, sort of to tee us up for people who understand this situation much better than I do. But I must say that I was, like everyone else watching Al Jazeera, watching television, I've been very struck by what's been happening in Egypt and Tunisia. And I've been especially struck by what people give as the causes of what's happening there. For example, lack of jobs, youth populations that feel frustrated by the politics. But I was actually looking at some of the comparisons made by Donny Roderick, who's at Harvard, and he was observing that the recent Human Development Report shows Tunisia, for example, ranked 6th among 135 countries in terms of improvement in its Human Development Index. Egypt was ranked 14th, and so Tunisia is ahead of Malaysia, Hong Kong, Mexico, India. Egypt and Tunisia have enjoyed very strong economic growth rates, so that the idea that economic stagnation in total GDP terms is one of the causes doesn't seem to hold very much. Tunisia's life expectancy is quite high, which at 74 is higher than Hungary's or Estonia's, and these countries are much wealthier in per capita terms than Tunisia. And the number of Egyptian kids enrolled in school is quite broad compared to, for example, number of Egyptian children in school very much matches Malaysia. So the issue of the human development aspect is there, but it seems to be slightly tenuous, or it needs to be argued much more rigorously than I've seen it done. At the same time, at least what that seems to me to indicate is that good economics does not necessarily lead to good politics. And certainly there seems to be an especial sensitivity to the issue of corruption and nepotism driving a frustration of many people. As of last count, I noted that anti-government demonstrations are not limited to North Africa or to that region which we all call the Middle East, but in Cameroon there have been protests very much sparked by what's going on, calling for the oust of Paul Biya. In Gabon as well. In Zimbabwe, as you see, the police just arrested 46 people because they were watching videos of demonstrations in Egypt and Tunisia. And the police spokesperson said, if I was to quote him, videos of the uprising in Egypt and Tunisia were being shown to the guests of a party who attended as a way to motivate the people to subvert a constitutionally elected government. So there's something in the air which very much, I think, reminds me, I'm not very old, but it does remind me of the early 1990s as a Kenyan, when government after government was bowing to the demand for multi-party democracy after decades of autocracy. And so this is an exciting time. But one of the things that really struck me and I'm wondering about, in terms of me being ignorant about it, is how the digital realm comes into play. I've read things saying that if not for Facebook and Twitter, there would have been no revolution or no uprising in Egypt, or at least not a successful one. On the other side, I've read sort of more the views of a Malcolm Gladwell, who suggests that no, people have always had reasons to revolt and rise up, and certainly social media is not what people have depended on, and so it might be some sort of assistance, but it's certainly not crucial. So we wondered what this argument would mean going forward in the rest of Africa. That is to say, we noted that authoritarian regimes, and perhaps even democratic ones, are taking very careful note of what's happening in North Africa, and they're going to react to it in one way or another. Uganda, which has just completed its election, the Ugandan security services were trying to suppress the use of certain words on social media and on SMS. Now, technically, I'm not sure they can do that, but already you can see that the instinct is to carefully police the internet and carefully police communications technologies. We have other regimes that are not pressing buttons to put them off, to switch off the internet, but really are doing things such as crowdsourced censorship that are being much more subtle in the way they approach the internet. So I asked our panelists to come and join us in asking the question of who will win this battle in Africa between pro-democracy forces, broadly understood, and authoritarian regimes. That is it for me. I'm going to chair the session when we begin. But what I've asked all our panelists to do is to speak quite briefly as a sort of introduction to the discussion. And the discussion to follow, I think we have so much to learn from each other. So it's not going to be a situation where the panel teaches or the panel lectures. It's going to really be a conversation that I hope you're going to come in on very strongly. Now, from Egypt, we have Professor Mohammed Bamyeh. I will introduce people just one by one rather than all of them, since in fact you have a pretty nice bio of all the speakers. So I won't go into sort of reading it word by word. But I was actually very struck and impressed by Professor Bamyeh's immediate writing on what was happening in Tunisia and Egypt, and he's written a series of essays called Field Notes from Egypt and Field Notes from Tunisia that I think really came to the different constituencies that are on the move, the different constituencies that made up this movement he's been doing for many years. As you can see, one of his books is Anarchy as Order, The History and Future of Civic Humanity, The Existential Foundations of Governance. He's been thinking a lot about globalization and the development of civil society. And so I asked Professor Bamyeh to join us, and the technology seems to be holding for now. So, Professor, perhaps you can give us a short introduction and a sort of tee us off, and then, of course, we'll come back to you during the discussion.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be joining you here. I just want to say a few words about that I did not complete it because of the revolutions, which are unpredictable by their nature, but I was glad to be here when it happened. One of the things that struck me about the number of revolutions that are happening here in Egypt, as well as in Tunisia and now Egypt, of course, that they are, as you said, they don't seem to be motivated entirely, at least, or to a large extent, by economic conditions. They're happening in countries that are wealthy, and also in countries that are not so wealthy. They seem to have a common, some fundamental fact, which is that all these societies basically have become much more modern than the governments. And the revolutions are a way of introducing, I suppose, what one calls modernity to government from the old, as opposed to the old model where a developmental state was supposed to introduce a developmental society. Right? And you see that we can talk, of course, about what that means, society becoming more modern than government. There are all kinds of indicators that must look at that. and also what it means that the governments are pre-modern, even though they may preside over some kind of economic indicators, but nonetheless they establish systems that are more or less closed systems, and that is really the feature of government that doesn't work any longer, and we see these solutions. We see the modernity of the society in a number of the fact that these social movements, these revolutions are characterized by an enormous amount of confidence. That it's not every day that you see a large number of unarmed civilians without any resources, without organization even, without leaders, not even symbolic leaders, standing basically in front of the tyrannical power of a government that is known for its mercilessness or its support. That requires an enormous amount of confidence that has developed over time. You also see it in the fact that all these solutions pretty much have marginal features to them, in the sense that started out from marginal country, from the countryside, collective areas, and they became national revolutions very quickly out of this culture. They also tend to have a spontaneous character to them, which I'm actually trying to study at length, but it is really very important. And by that I mean a lot of things in minimal planning, resistance to having a revolution embodied in leadership or party or permanent organization, the situational field tactics being prepared for long-term strategy, the informal, almost conversational kind of approach to planning, the preference for dynamism as opposed to doctrine or platform or hierarchy, the extension of the spontaneity of everyday life into a style of revolution, and finally the spontaneity as a way by which we discovered limits of the past. So in all these revolutions, the overthrow of the regime was not the first demand that was raising the revolution. In Egypt, for example, even though now it was called the January 25th revolution, January 25th, no one called for the overthrow of the Mubarak. That demand crystallized 3 days later and became, of course, unwavering after that. So spontaneity was a way by which a large number of people converge on protest movement and through confronting the government discovered that there was a box. And also they discovered something that is incredibly new, which is they are united as a people. And that, of course, leads me to the third kind of fundamental feature of this system, beyond the marginal and spontaneous character, is that they seem to be connected to the growth of a new form of patriotism. Right? And that is very important. That means many things. In one way, it doesn't mean nationalism in the whole kind of European sense, but rather a sense of society kind of overcoming feelings within it that the revolutionary moment are realized to have been or seen as having been implanted on purpose by the ruling elites so as to keep society divided and easier to control. A good example of that in Egypt is the Muslim Coptic, which seems to be a serious kind of divide just before the revolution. And in the revolution itself, I saw purposefully how there are so many signs that carry kind of both Coptic and Muslim kind of signals, how people prayed together or protected each other prayer in Tahrir Square in public, as a symbol of the notion that this is a new type of society that is above all divisions, and that it is united against one tyranny at a time. So that also interesting about this new patriotism is that it does not seem to require unified leadership as opposed to the leadership in contrast to the leadership of the government. And then in contrast to what we saw 3 decades earlier, the Iranian revolution, we saw is that as the Shah was collapsing, Khomeini emerged as the natural leader of the new order. Here you don't have that. You have three revolutions, one in Tunisia, one in Egypt, and now an ongoing one in Libya, where the regime is collapsing, and we have two regimes that had their head collapsed. Yet, the opposition to the revolution has not generated its own leader as a substitute, and most people seem to be happy with that. There is no strong demand for generating new leader. So it seems that this new type of patriotism is based on sort of nailing an element of spontaneity and extending that into perhaps the style of the government order, but also seems to be based on the notion that that we don't have to be united forever beyond the kind of revolutionary moment in which we were united for the cause of removing the regime and introducing a new kind of condition. So those are what I see so far as common features of these revolutions. They are being experienced, as far as I can tell, and as great awakening. So they are not simply revolutions about giving an attorney. They also, a lot of people tell me that they are psychologically revolutionary. There are so many kind of inward kind of sense of impotence they have felt all their life, and all that kind of sense of impotence is now expunged outside of them as positive energy, as a sense of responsibility for the public sphere, as exercising membership or popular committees, sense of responsibility for the safety of the neighborhood, discovering your neighbor again as a really human person as opposed to a superficial kind of person you're connected in a superficial way from the world. And so many other kind of ethical consequences that have been emerging out of this sense of new patriotism. And it is empowering in the sense that it seems to have a sense of independence and confidence that they have, without which these revolutions would not have sustained themselves or as long as without organization, without leadership, and they seem to be happy going on without those. Now, I don't know how much time I have. I can stop here and pick it up later. I have many other points to say, but I can say just one more thing, just in the passing right now, is that I tried as much as possible to look at the local scene and to see how the revolution looks from the perspective of the participants in it. And then every now and then I did emerge out of that kind of immersion. I emerged out of that atmosphere and tried to read the US press, European press, and see how the revolution was covered. And I saw an incredible disconnect, the kinds of questions that are being asked in the Western that they hear about seem to be completely irrelevant from this point of view. There's so much talk of Muslim or the press, press circle as well, about the Muslim Brotherhood, about the prospect of Islamism, about Israel and its future in this nuclear collaboration, about oil. Not all those issues are important here. Right? No one is talking about them, right? And of course, they can be addressed. It's not as though I'm dismissing them. But I think it is completely irresponsible to foreground those kinds of questions because there's something of a historical, epochal significance that is happening right here. Right? There's a social renewal process that's going on. There's a sense of great awakening that everyone is participating in. There is a sense of rediscovery, right, of what it means to be a nation, so to speak. And there is a sense that we are entitled basically to oppose our governments that represent nobody, even though we had known that all along, but we never had that kind of confidence that we have developed at this moment. So many modernist or modernizing processes that showed us that we have become kind of more modern than the kinds of government that we have, and therefore we deserve definitely better. And that, of course, need to be seen from the other perspective as well, namely the fact that most governments that are exposed to those revolutions are unable to respond adequately, or they respond late, or they can't comprehend what is happening at all, because the people they talk to are not their own people. They talk to geopolitical partners. They talk amongst themselves most of the time. And most of those regimes that have been characterized by longevity in office, which can are not used to be contested in this way, and therefore they're out of touch. So it seems to me right now, in the as far as I can tell, the wave that we're seeing is indeed spreading everywhere. Whether we're going to have a revolution in every country, I'm not sure, but I'm sure we are going to have some radical transformation happening, whether from the low or from the top. In every country, at least in the Arab world, sometime very soon. The process seems to have begun, and it does not seem to be very dependent on economics. It seems to be dependent, or rather related, more in the sense of society, because of educational processes, because of communication media, and because of the networking, the styles of modern networking that have evolved, that is basically used to organize itself in different way than before, and also have a much more content since it's all that. So I'll stop here, and hopefully we can pick up whatever threads I have missed, which I'm sure are many in the conversation as well.
Thank you very much, Professor Bamyeh. Next, and thank you for keeping to the time. That was a very precise 12 minutes, even though you're so far away that I can't actually flag you down even if you'd kept going. So, but I can certainly do it for these people sitting here with me. Just some of those comments, new forms of patriotism, spontaneity, coming from the margins to grabbing power, or to at least displacing the powerful, a society that is more modern than the state, peoples who are perhaps further advanced in democratic aspiration than their leaders, the new type of society evolving in Tahrir Square, an awakening, ethics. Sally, these are things that finally have to be mediated somehow by the way states are managing the internet, by the way internet governance is being built and developed. Somehow these aspirations are going to have to travel through established infrastructures. And so I thought perhaps you could tell us more, not necessarily about that, but get us deeper into the policy aspect. But before that, let me introduce you. Sally Wentworth is a senior manager for public policy at the Internet Society. And prior to this responsibility, she was assistant director for telecommunications and information policy at the Office of Science and Technology Policy at the White House for 2 years. And she has been principal policy advisor on internet policy issues at the U.S. Department of State. And so I think you come with a lot of experience about the development of, please.
Thank you, and thank you for that kind introduction. You listed some of the themes that we've just heard, and I wanted to pick up on one more, which is the comment that what we're seeing in the region right now is that everybody is participating. And I think that's really core to the concept and the foundational principles of the Internet. When we look at where the Internet came from, the founders refer to it as this grand collaboration, that it really was designed as a distributed network, that it was designed that there would be no central control. It was designed that anybody could innovate, that everyone could participate. And that's really what has fueled the growth. That's what's fueled the success of the Internet around the world. We're seeing the Internet user population, some people say it's reached 2 billion. There's discrepancy on one side or the other, but you're seeing tremendous growth rates, obviously, in internet usage. You see a commercial internet economy globally of $1.5 trillion as an estimate, and still growing. And what we at the Internet Society see is that this is really based on the principles of the architecture of the Internet. That it's distributed, it's resilient, it routes around problems, that's the technology, and that anybody can innovate at the edge, that an application like Facebook can be deployed and can be used and can be successful. The interesting thing of Facebook is really the fact that somebody could think of it, put it out there, and everyone can make use of it and make it better. So I think what's interesting is that over the last decade, as this tremendous growth has taken place, we've also seen policymakers struggle with that a little bit. We see governments, Tunisia and Egypt in particular, in this particular example, had very relatively robust, quote-unquote, ICT strategies. They were educating their young people. They were, I remember during my time in government going to these countries and being shown their digital hubs and their internet aspirations. And yet, at the same time, what we see is a view by many in government that this can somehow, this technology that I've described as open and as collaborative, can somehow be put in the box of traditional communications. So the mechanisms that governments have used in the past to control broadcasting or to control telecommunications would also somehow be effective in the internet environment. And to some extent, they have been. But what we see, as someone pointed out the other day, you may be able to control 95% of your internet users in your country, but there's going to be a certain percentage of the population that figures out how to get around things, that figures out how to communicate. People have a fundamental desire to communicate, and the internet is not a panacea, but it's made that it's helped people realize that desire in a way that they had never been able to do that before, that they can get their message out about the struggles in their country, about the opportunities in their country, about the business opportunities that they might pursue on a global basis that's never happened before. Governments want to be a part of that. Governments want to be part of the global information economy, and yet they want to maintain certain levels of control. And I think what we're starting to see is obviously that dichotomy is breaking down to a large extent in some of these countries. And from our perspective, one of the things that's important is that we work very diligently to ensure that community of support exists within the country. That we have internet engineers in country, that we have people developing applications that work and that apply to their particular environment, that they can maintain the technology, that they can benefit from it at the local level, not just relying on external sources. That base of support is what allows people to then utilize Facebook or develop the next application that's particularly relevant in their culture and their political environment to meet their aspirations. So there was a comment was, if not for Facebook, would we have seen this kind of political movement? And I would argue if it wasn't for the open, decentralized internet architecture, we probably wouldn't see this. You wouldn't see Facebook, and you wouldn't see this kind of collaboration. So I think from the Internet Society's perspective, we're seeing this tremendous energy and these developments in North Africa and in the Middle East, and as we've seen also, growing. But at the core of that is from a technology point of view, is an internet architecture that we shouldn't take for granted. that the internet governance mechanisms that are multi-stakeholder, that allow everyone to participate, that empower users, that empower technology development, we can't take that for granted, whether it's here in the United States or in Africa as they develop the technology. That competition of technologies, that competition of providers is fundamental. Open and transparent regulatory processes. Sometimes it's very dull to talk about things like spectrum management and licensing, but these are all things that make the fundamentals of the internet work well and work to the advantage of the end user, which is really what has empowered what we're seeing, I think, in the region, and something that we think is very important. So if I leave you with one thought, at least to start the discussion, is that we can't take it for granted. This doesn't come out of nowhere. This comes because people are dedicated to the model and to the internet ecosystem. And that's something that we need to preserve and to promote, both in the U.S. and in regions like North Africa and throughout the continent.
Thank you very much. Perhaps when we get back to the question and answer session, we'll get into if you can stop the 95% of the people from getting on, how do you do that? Because that might be a pretty good number to go for, even if you miss the 5%. So perhaps we'll get into what the states are doing. But next, I wanted to introduce Chris Spence, who really needs very little introduction from me. I think he was one of the earliest people to start talking about the role of the internet in democratic development. You've done that globally, but you've had a special and specific concern and focus on Africa, I think, from the beginning of your career at NDI. So perhaps you can tell us, and maybe even tell us a little bit about what, according to me, are the bad guys.
Bad guys, sure. Sure, thanks, Martin. I'll be able to pick up nicely on both of those comments. I see a few familiar faces in the room, but for those who don't know NDI is an international nonprofit, nonpartisan organization, and we do democracy programs in about 70 countries around the world, including 25 countries in Africa. And for the last 15 years or so, we've been building technology tools into our democracy programs. And so we have a fair amount of understanding about the way civic groups, political parties, election monitors, and others use technology to advance political goals, hold governments accountable, safeguard elections, and that kind of thing. To frame the conversation, and I'm really going to end up talking about the specific ways that authoritarian regimes are making democracy support difficult and the way that groups are responding to this. But to frame it a little bit, the internet, the way we see the internet and communication technologies, whether they're accessed by internet through computers or through phones, are really now embedded in the lives of citizens. And you can't separate the politics from the technology, from social and commercial uses of the technology, and this is making it very difficult for authoritarian regimes. And so whether you're looking at democratic changes in democracies like the United States and others, technologies are having sort of disruptive or disruptive characteristics. They're changing the dynamics in which politics are played, and in developing countries, and certainly in these more authoritarian regimes, we'll talk specifically about some of the behavior changes that we're seeing from the regimes and from our partners who are working to create political space in these environments. The second thing I would say is that because of the computing uses, we need to back up a little bit and say that while the internet and mobile technologies are useful for civic groups and they're using them in useful ways to create space, the authoritarians in tough countries are using the same tools to either hinder access to information, use the tools against civic groups and citizens, or both. And so that dynamic has set up a situation now where you can no longer, I don't think NDI ever said this, but you certainly can't make a direct correlation between new media, social media, and the internet and positive democratic reform. There's no question that the introduction of these technologies have changed the landscape for citizen participation in both democratic and non-democratic states, but there's nothing definitive about the direction that this will go. There are moments of opportunity that are often created, elections, uprisings, spontaneous or otherwise, in these situations, and citizens need to be prepared to use these tools and technologies in safe and effective ways in these situations. And given the events of the last several weeks, we can be certain that the regimes in closed societies, and I would say in Africa increasingly going forward, these governments are going to be prepared to limit the use of these tools and proactively use them against citizens. So the question that Martin asked me to specifically address today was what types of online repression are possible and likely in more closed countries in Africa, and then what can activists do in response? And so I'll jump into that fairly specifically, and I'm going to try to summarize because I've got a lot. It's a big topic, but I'd start by sharing four specific thoughts. And one is that communication technologies and social media can be seen as catalysts or enablers in these environments, and I think this was already mentioned by Mohammed as well. But they enable a process which is driven by underlying factors, whether it's the economy, human rights, or some of the social theory that Mohammed shared. Technologies in themselves are simply enablers, and it's always got to be a combination of online activity and offline activity. With the majority being offline activity, it actually makes political change. So online activity in and of itself is not going to bring about political change that we're talking about. The second point I'd make is due to the structure of mobile and communication networks, authoritarian regimes will typically have the upper hand over citizens using these tools and controlling information. And because of that advantage, and I'll talk about that in a minute, there are no completely safe ways for citizens or organizations to use these technologies in these countries. The key for these groups is understanding the risks, understanding the security environment they're working in, and then deciding how to use tools most appropriately with balancing their risk tolerance in these environments. And the last point I would make, not directly related, but we've been talking about it already, is that private companies provide a lot of the communications services and they play a key role in all of this. And I think many companies are still grappling with their policies and approaches when they're called to make decisions in these type of difficult environments. So with that said, I'm going to skip everything I was going to say about Tunisia and Egypt because I really want to get into the specific tools of repression, I guess. And I would say that if you look at political work in these environments, governments use three basic approaches to control information and squander political work. The first is they try and identify individuals so they can take action to discourage their participation, and I'll talk a bit about how they do that. The second is they try to block access to the services that people need to communicate and organize online through mobile monitoring and surveillance and things like that. And the third, and this is relatively new, is they're starting to use these platforms and services to counter the movements with direct propaganda. So they're actually infiltrating and getting involved in the social media. So they're doing all three of these things. If you look first at targeting individuals, the first category I mentioned, three things happen. There's a lot of legal mechanisms that are used. Authoritarian regimes use legal codes as tools of control. They use libel or anti-incitement laws to quash expression while monitoring and shut down requirements for intermediaries like internet service providers and mobile phone companies. And they're sort of positioned as censors. They're required by law in many countries, including China and others, to uphold these filtering and monitoring tools or policy laws. And lastly, and this is really important, more and more regimes are now requiring registration and licensing requirements for things like blogging, using mobile phones, and using the internet in general, usually in the name of stopping terrorism or cybercrime or something like that, which really does strip anonymity from users and really has a chilling effect on free speech. There are a number of recent examples that demonstrate this sort of legal techniques, and I think it's not specifically, it's more of a long-term problem. But organizations and citizens that are trying to be active in these environments need to understand the legal environment that they're working under and identify the potential tactics that these regimes are going to use against them. so they can look at the laws that the telecom regulators are using, and et cetera. And then citizens and election observers and violence monitors and everybody else, they need to be aware of also of the limits on speech and assembly that are allowed, and their risk tolerance for spending time in prison or whatever the consequences might be. And then they need to decide how to act as they begin to plan their communication strategies. So that's the legal piece. The second piece is monitoring and surveillance. We all know that these regimes use monitoring techniques to target activists with sophisticated techniques that monitor not only internet use but also mobile phone conversations, SMS, and any non-encrypted data that travels across these networks is susceptible to being archived, searched, and then later used against individuals. There are also more sophisticated attacks like phishing attacks and denial of service and others, which basically I guess distributed. Oh, sorry, I lost my point here. Let's just say that let's start with phishing attacks. Basically, there are ways that they can compromise user accounts and passwords so that people can then get access not only to a user's Facebook account but also their network of people. So then they've got a list of people to go after. Phishing was used in Tunisia recently in the uprising, and also interestingly to make a connection to Africa. In Uganda last weekend they had an election, and for the first time that I'm aware of in sub-Saharan Africa, SMS monitors were filtered using incriminating keywords, and the Ugandan SMS providers were coerced into participating in this because of the legal relationship with Uganda Communications Commission. So to respond to this monitoring environment, our approach is always to coach people to use a secure communications plan. It's got to be developed holistically that takes into account the risks and communication needs of the organization or individual that's working, and considers the environment that they're working in. They need to know the tactics that the regime is using. Unfortunately, if a tech-savvy regime is targeting a particular individual, compromise is virtually undetectable and probably unstoppable, so you need to plan accordingly. If they really want to get you, it's very difficult to prevent. So the most basic way that activists need to protect themselves is keep their computer up to date with security updates and use antivirus software. Believe it or not, around the world that's not done widely enough, and that's the first baby step. They also need to provide strategies for backing up and storing information in encrypted and secure ways, possibly in the cloud, to make sure that if their equipment is compromised or their computer is compromised remotely, their data is protected. And the last thing, another component of this that's really important to talk about, and that is that we're talking about trained activists here, and they're often in a position to make good decisions about communication technologies, but it's everyday citizens that are also at risk, especially in the movements like we saw in Egypt and Tunisia, the protest-type movements. Everyday tools like cell phones, web platforms, email platforms, Facebook and social networking, other tools can unwittingly put average citizens at risk. So there are significant risks that average citizens need to take in mind. Oftentimes, the way these technologies are used in these environments pose the greatest threat. For example, there's been a couple of examples. For example, regimes can easily geolocate mobile phones now, use facial recognition technology to look at images and videos and begin to map and identify people. And there have been two examples recently that are widely known. One is Belarus's government in December used cell phone towers to triangulate and identify people. And then the registration of their SIM cards made it easy for those folks to identify. And I think, as Mohammed mentioned, Iran did a similar thing in 2009 with people that were photographed and images that were posted on social network platforms. So that's the monitoring and surveillance piece against individuals. Regimes also commonly block web services, communication platforms, and I won't go into this into too much detail, but basically, it's very easy for these regimes with certain firewalls to block specific websites, and also they can throttle websites. So they can basically ratchet down the bandwidth so you can't watch videos. All you can do is, sort of dial-up connection type of activities online. So they don't get accused of shutting down the internet, but they've hindered the use for some of the most important and impactful media, which is video. There are also conventional hacking and denial of service attacks against websites. We have a number of partners around the world, and this is on the increase, where their websites are getting attacked by denial of service. And so one of the areas that we need to work with civic groups around the world now is hardening your websites, creating more secure web platforms, and hosting them in ways that make them less vulnerable to being brought down by denial of service attacks. And this, like I said, is on the rise. A great example yesterday of a hack. I don't know if you all followed this, but related to the Middle East, the Iranian Cyber Army, which is a group of people who act on behalf of Iranian interests, apparently, took over dozens of Voice of America websites. This was yesterday or the day before, and they posted a big message on the front page of the websites decrying the U.S. Involvement in the 2011 Arab Revolution. So that's an example of the kind of things that are going on online. And the last thing I'll mention is that the regimes are starting to embrace social media. And this is basically authoritarian regimes deciding to join the fun, and they've begun to infiltrate social networks, engage in social media, join Facebook groups, interject posts and comments. In China, they pay people to blog and sort of push propaganda, and even monitoring Twitter accounts and hashtags now. NDI recently started being followed by the KGB in Belarus on our Twitter handle because of some interesting blog posts we wrote about Belarus. But there's also in Egypt, there's a fair amount of number of reports where anti-Mubarak Facebook groups were being infiltrated by sort of propagandists, and in Tunisia, instances where the accounts were taken over and administered by government-friendly agents completely. So in response, this is a new area, but the activists are basically using social media to raise awareness about these issues. They identify trusted people and verified people on the networks, and then they spread information about who's legitimate and who's not, and try to use the media themselves to counter these kind of attack, or these kind of sort of infiltrating approaches. So that's really that's the three sort of main areas that we see our partners struggle against. I think in general it looks like Uganda example being one, but I think the regimes in Africa who are still trying to control information and work in this space are going to do more of this. And for countries in Africa that are beginning, and activists and election monitoring groups and others in Africa that are working in this space, and Zimbabwe is an important example coming up. We're going to have to anticipate that these regimes learn from each other, that these environments are getting tougher, and the activists just don't have the advantage. When you can control your infrastructure, we're in a very difficult and challenging situation. So I'll stop there because I know I'm sure I went over, and I think there's a whole lot more to talk about in the Q&A.
Thank you, Chris. Not very much. Well, it seems to me one of the things that I'll challenge you in is if we're talking about in policy terms, DC terms, the U.S. government terms in terms of supporting these movements for democracy, which is one of the goals, self-identified goals of the U.S. In the world. It seems to be conflicting in a way with the U.S. government's own evolving posture towards internet freedom and freedom of speech. There seems to be a clash there. So I was going to ask later on how these can be supported when already there's a sort of drawing back from that here. Not completely, but I thought the WikiLeaks issue was very instructive in some of these instincts. And perhaps also this issue of how a lot of the internet and communications infrastructure is still being built in Africa. How can it be built differently to strengthen the ability for free speech to be protected as opposed to being limited? But I was going to just now invite the last speaker, Ms. June Arunga, who is both an entrepreneur and a filmmaker. And one of the films, the reason I invited her was that one of the films she made is called The Devil's Footpath, and it was aired by the BBC, in which she travels from Cairo to Cape Town. And in Cairo, she had a fascinating conversation with young Egyptians, just talking to them about their lives and talking to them about some of their frustrations. And then she later did a film with former President Jerry Rawlings, traveling through Africa asking who is to blame. And so, and after that, went on to start a company in Accra that specializes in mobile phone payments. So, Ms. Arunga, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. It's an honor to be here with all these very experienced people and experts in their fields. I have been a kind of activist for self-driven for about 10 years. And so I really feel I can empathize with the young people I see on the streets in these revolutionary times we're witnessing. For me, it was very exciting when these events started happening in Egypt, because in 2002, like Martin mentioned, I was in Egypt talking to people who at that time I had to dodge a government minder every day for 10 days to actually set up these interviews. I'd wake up in the morning and there'd be a government appointed minder to follow me around all day, everywhere I was going. This is the Egypt that I know. And even while coming from Kenya, Egypt was way more developed, and you could see that these people have better economic opportunities than where I was coming from. They were not free to just do regular stuff that in Kenya nobody followed me around, for example, when I was making films. But my impetus was, just as a young African, I was 22 at the time, very frustrated, like Dr. Bamyeh was mentioning, with that lag between our aspirations and the kind of pre-modern stance and policies of our governments. And having traveled through the continent, it was obvious that Kenya, as much as frustrating as it was for people I knew, a lot of people were living in situations that were much, much worse. Egypt was one example where I spoke to a lot of activists who introduced me to people that the government would the police, as you know, they had an state of emergency that has lasted since 1981, and the police would just pull people off the streets, douse them in kerosene, set them ablaze. I met several of these people recovering from burns from the police. Went to Sudan and spoke to a lot of young people who did not have access to the internet but were fighting a government that was bombing them. I arrived in a village in Sudan where just a week before the government had bombed this village, and this is in order to build an oil pipeline. Speaking to young people who say they know what oil is, they were very aware of the injustice that was being done to them. Talking to young kids who did not know what a nuclear family was. Why? Because they're bombed so often that families get reconstituted with whatever adults are available and whatever children are available. The kind of lives people are leading to just try and get by. Basically, the justice deficit, for lack of a proper term, is enormous because of this lag between the nature of the government and what people perceive as what their lives ought to be like. Now, in the years since my film work began, of traveling across the continent, Congo, Angola, all these countries, something has happened, which is time and space has been folded by cell phones, largely. The internet is one thing, but cell phones have networked people in ways that have enabled movements to gain support internationally and communicate more effectively, of course. So as much as I agree that the technology itself is not what is driving the change, and that there were people fighting. These young people in Sudan, I met people in their 20s who killed their first man when they were 6, not because they're murderers, but because that's just what life was. These people have been fighting for a long time, and it's interesting to now be part of this conversation of the war kind of moving into the digital space and what might happen with that. I'm very confident that that despite the autocrats trying to find ways to control this space, there's still, it's not like we're living in a virtual world entirely. There's still the non-virtual world, and people will find ways to get around this. We've seen the steady march from, people fighting against slavery, people fighting against colonialism, people fighting against the single-party states in Africa. So this is just a new wave that we're seeing, and so I'm looking forward to the discussion and joining in whichever way I can contribute from my experience. The last of which was trying to set up a company in Accra that would network Africans across the board using their cell phones and text messaging in order to trade. Intra-African trade is lower than it really ought to be, and some friends of mine and I thought that if people could make payments and make orders using text messaging, then perhaps it would be a way of getting around governments and around the restrictions for trade. So if we could use the, what do they call, DHL and the like, there's courier services to actually move goods across the borders and use SMS to make the orders and so on, then perhaps we would be able to get around the restrictions on movement, because this is one big problem in Africa, just being able to move across borders. This is some of the backwardness of government policy, the restrictions on setting up companies and so on and so forth. But there's just this wealth of experience I've had in going into these spaces and documenting people's frustrations over a long time, and I look forward to contributing as we get into the discussion.
Thank you very much. And I think you sort of brought us to where the issue of the internet and the mobile phone is not merely to do with democratization, but perhaps also speaks to issues of opportunity, economic development, etc. Now, it's 20 minutes to 2, and I was going to beg you, and you can shout me down or something, or Twitter it, if I could take 15 more minutes of your time, so that we finish at 2:15, because I would really like us all to have a chance to really engage, rather than have a 20-minute question and answer session. If that's okay with you, please forgive me for taking that much more time. Now, I was going to put it out to the floor for you to ask questions and make comments, but if I may ask you to do something, and that is, let's make it a pointed session that goes around what can be done to support freedom and democratization in Africa on the digital realm. So in other words, if you make a comment or ask a question, aim it towards the practicalities that can emerge from supporting these movements, whether they're legal, whether it's financial, whether it's any form of government policy here in Washington or elsewhere. But the floor is yours. Let me come to the...
Okay, I'll try. My name is Mohammed Ibrahim. So my comment is, I did a lot of... My name is Mohammed Ibrahim. So my comment is, I did a lot of work in Egypt in 2005, 2007, and 2010 around research, basically grassroots technology use in Egypt. And I think the issues that came up here around sort of how the people use the technology, especially the architecture, And when you get to the idea of what can be done, I think a lot of focus has been put on sort of the activists around training them and providing systems to sort of help them circumvent. But I think I agree that in some sense the upper hand is with the government in many of these cases because there's no rules of the road, right? There's no global rules of the road of what's acceptable. And we see these coming time and time again with, say, the BlackBerry issue when it happened in India, it happened in Qatar, it happened in UAE. We've seen it with the internet shutdown. We've seen it over and over again. So we can say, okay, wait, this is a problem. But there's really no global norms, like rules of the road. How do we sanction governments if they do certain activities in the digital realm? Because there is no systematic international agreements around what that constitutes.
Thank you. There's a gentleman right in front of him, and then we'll come here to the front.
My name is Clark Gascoigne. I'm with Global Financial Integrity. Just sort of going off of what he said, I'm wondering, you did put a lot on the activists can do this and try to do that. The only thing I heard that people like us, we're an NGO, that we should strengthen our web security just to make sure that we don't get hacked or shut down by attacks from foreign governments. Is there anything else that we can do to make our information that we provide more accessible to people in countries where information is restricted?
Sure. Okay. There's a gentleman here in the front.
Okay.
Some of the analysts who have looked at...
Could you introduce yourself, please?
My name is Malik Chaka, and I earn my bread at Millennium Challenge Corporation. Some analysts have argued that the democratization movement now sweeping North Africa and the Near East will not spread to the rest of the continent. And they came up with arguments that are basically economists' arguments. I'd like to know what the people here think. But I would also take notice that governments in Africa, south of the Saharan, Baladi, Sudan, have also, in fact, been very concerned about what's going on in North Africa. And they have cautioned their citizens, this is not Egypt. If you go to the streets, we'll get you.
Thank you. We'll take those questions. Let's keep our replies as brief as we can. Perhaps, Professor Bamyeh, we can come to you first.
Thanks. I'm not sure where to start. I'll just give you my own sense of it is that, which is that most of the networking that was important, and activism that proved to be important for the making of the revolution happened before the revolution. And that was important because the internet was shut down for a whole week after, from basically January 28th onwards. That was completely unexpected. No one expected that to happen. And yet the revolution actually went on in spite of the lack of access to the internet, as well as lack of access to mobile phone connections of any kind for a couple of days. But what seemed to have been important is the fact that much earlier activism and connectivity have already happened in the preceding few years. So I think revolutions happen not just because of Facebook, not just because there's internet, but they happen because there is a reason for them to happen. There is a social reason for them to happen. And the internet, mentioned before, is simply a tool of networking and organizing. Now, of course, when I was there at Tahrir Square, I wished I had internet, and I wish I could find out what was happening, and there was no way to find out. But any news that came from any source, anyone who had any device that worked, that single person, became the source of news for 100,000 people. And that was important when I saw at some point, for example, during that week, Google came up with a way to circumvent the internet launch button by allowing Twitter streaming through cell phone technologies. At that point, cell phones could be used. the one problem with that solution was that it was too expensive and also available to people who had a particular kind of telephone. So I think the answer may lie less in any government policy than in developing new kind of technologies that are able to circumvent kind of the suspension of communication technology, because that kind of suspension is to be expected in times of trouble, especially in times of revolution and so on and so forth. So new techniques, new kind of way to circumvent that blockage of information are important to look at.
Yeah, thank you. I thought, and if I was to add just a little bit to this question, the conversation in much of sub-Saharan Africa, especially places such as the Horn of Africa, when government officials are told about the internet, they think of it as two things. They think of a Silicon Valley growing in their backyard, and they think of Al-Qaeda and recruitment and people being taught how to build bombs, etc. And in that part of the world, security is the last defense of the rogue. And so how really are we going to come up with global rules when the security imperative is so strong, not only by authoritarian regimes, but even by democratic ones?
Well, I think that's an excellent point. Several years back, the United Nations held a World Summit on the Information Society, and governments, primarily from around the world, came together to talk about the future of the Internet in their countries. And of course, part of the irony was that government didn't build the technology, in many cases doesn't run it, isn't the one innovating, and yet they were the ones having the discussion amongst themselves. And so I think if you know, to the extent that global rules are desired, what's essential is that there be a civil society and that there be a technology component to that discussion, and that be integral to the discussion. Having governments from around the world sit and talk to one another about the future of the Internet isn't going to sustain that kind of architecture that I was talking about earlier, and it really could, in some cases, maybe enhance some of the fears instead of the opportunities. So I think I fully agree that, you know, what we're seeing right now, we're maybe at an inflection point, but this has been developing for some time. The deployment of the technology has been happening for some time. The communities have been organizing, have been discussing, and maybe it hasn't been about democracy. Maybe it's been about other social issues of interest, you know, health or economics, or developing methods of doing better commerce that can then, at an inflection point, develop into this democratic movement that we're seeing now. And what we'll probably see come out of this will be tremendous innovation. People and governments are learning, unfortunately, I think in some perhaps negative ways about what can happen, but activists are also learning. Technologists are learning. There's a tremendous amount of discussion in the technical community right now about what methodologies governments have been using. How do we ensure that there's communities within countries that can still communicate despite that? And so while you know, there's obviously cause for concern, what I would just emphasize is that this is a collaborative movement, and having governments sit in a vacuum and make these decisions is quite dangerous.
Chris? Sure, I would just agree with all that as well, and say one other thing, and that is the private. I see the private sector having a huge role in this situation. As I mentioned before, the governments don't have control of the infrastructure. The companies do, in much of the infrastructure, and they've really got to have that relationship sorted out. The tension between extremely lucrative markets in the internet space, but really in the telecom space, especially in Africa, with the sort of ethical questions around when you allow your services to be shut down and how they're allowed to be used in certain environments, creates a real tough environment for corporations. And I think that global standard, I know there's a group called the Global Network Initiative, which you probably all heard of, which is a group of corporations that are trying to grapple with some of these questions. I think if you leave it up to governments, you'll get the Declaration of Human Rights and other things which they can choose to ignore, and many do. And so I'm not sure that those mechanisms will necessarily solve the problem, but I think civil society, the private sector, and then maybe governments too have to figure out how to deal with this. I totally agree that whenever, without any sort of regulatory mechanisms, a race to the bottom is probably what we'll see. And what then you get is, rather than sort of U.S. companies having their technology used in these environments, which have backdoors for U.S. law enforcement, which these regimes use, is that preferable to having rather than sanctioning out that equipment, then all of a sudden you've got Chinese equipment in there? And is that better or worse? And how does democracy fare in an environment, a global marketplace, where these products and services could be coming from anywhere on the planet, and really grappling with those? It's got to be I think it's some level a non-technical question, because technology is going to be very difficult to regulate the use of that technology.
June, we had a question about are these protests going to be limited to North Africa, and if they're going to travel south, how are they going to overcome some of the fractured, divided politics in different African countries?
This is speculation on my part, with the best of my knowledge, but I think that the demographics in sub-Saharan Africa favor the change direction rather than the autocrats more. You have a situation where in sub-Saharan Africa 75% of the population is under 30. So they're really the ones who know how the internet works and know a lot about this technology. And most of them, I'm trying to imagine somebody in their mid-30s, 40s in Africa today getting into power and behaving like the 80-year-olds we have running the countries is kind of a stretch. So there'll be a leap in modernization of the governments just by virtue of the generation gap between the people in power today and those outside. And I think that I'm not sure that we are where Egypt, say, and Tunisia are. You have somebody like Mubarak who has been in power for a very long time, and there has been there's been the kind of intellectual movements that have been built because of the level of education and so on in North Africa are probably more robust than you have in some sub-Saharan African countries that have been lagging behind economically and so on, and haven't had the resources to educate people as much. So you have this young population that is not as widely educated as people in the north, and so it might take a little bit more time to get to that place where people are having similar evolutions, but it's actually hard to generalize, really. It's hard to generalize. The countries are very different. Kenya, for example, has been going through the kind of more due process method, which is the elections, referenda, reviewing the constitution, and that kind of longer route rather than to the streets. And they go to the streets, but it's not get out of government now. It's coalitions being built within the political parties. So there's the countries where you've had an opening, a widening of the political space so that people have been able to maneuver and change the system bit by bit and not be pushed to the wall with emergency laws for, 30 years. So you have places that have been pent up more, and so there's this kind of, you just have to go. And places like Kenya where you have more dialogue and so on. Then places like Uganda where you do have a Yoweri Museveni who's overstayed his welcome, according to a lot of Ugandans. And yet my mother went to school in Uganda for high school, and she told me when Moi was in power in Kenya, she used to say, don't talk about the president, just God chooses our leaders. We just pray for them. But it's because she was so traumatized when the Ugandans, Idi Amin came into power, and they all left school and went to the streets and danced, and nobody knew what Idi Amin was going to become. And so I think a lot of Ugandans, according to what my Ugandan friends say, are fatigued with change. They've had all these overthrows over time, and for the moment they want stability. They're happy to put up with somebody who's overstaying their welcome, so long as they make concessions of certain kinds and allow them to get on with economic activity and so on. So it's hard to generalize, but the demographic factor, I think, in Africa augurs well for change and modernization rather than more of the status quo. So whichever way things go, my sense is that there'll be changes is coming, it's pushing through, and young people are really the ones who are in the know with the technology. So if it comes to using and understanding how to manipulate the system, things are in their favor. But then lastly, there's a place like Ethiopia, for example, where the government still has a monopoly on the telecoms industry. Mm-hmm. They don't even have competition within telecoms itself, and therefore it makes it very difficult. They have much more control over the infrastructure. So I think until a year or 2 years ago, it was illegal to text message in Ethiopia. Not certain kinds of text messages. This text messaging was illegal because that's how afraid Meles was of young people and what they would do with this facility. So each country is different, I think, but where the forces are such that where people can, where the stew has brewed enough, it'll happen. The push will happen. And where it's still cooking, it's cooking, but it's cooking.
Thank you. I think perhaps as I was reading that the protests seem to be given a storyline. So the storyline we have is of Arab countries are rising up, Muslim countries are rising up. So if you don't happen to be part of that story, it's as if you're not rising up. So people are doing things in Gabon, but somehow it's not part of the story. And so it begs the question, if you're not on Al Jazeera, are you revolting? So there's some issue there with the way the stories, I think, are being framed. And I was noting perhaps even the issue of self-immolation, which happens it's a quite common act around the world. But suddenly now there was one in Vietnam, and they said it's because of local corruption. Then there was one in Senegal, and it was all being reported as a continuum to Tunisia. So there's a very interesting ways, I think, the way communications and news is driving these stories. We'll come to some other questions now. There's a gentleman there at the back.
Najib Ayashi with the Maghreb Center, a think tank on North African affairs, and I also happen to have worked on development issues in Africa. I would like to agree with Chris here. The IT technology and the internet are only tools that have been used by these young activists in Tunisia, in Egypt, to organize themselves, to form communities, firstly. They forge communities through the internet, through Facebook, through the social media, and then to organize the uprisings. I don't see the same kind of condition in sub-Saharan Africa. First, we don't have the same kind of authoritarian police state of the kind we had in Tunisia and Egypt. Anywhere in Africa, perhaps there have been attempts, there still, but the conditions are really not the same. In addition, about the internet, another comment, I think Africa has other issues like access to water, electricity, tackling the illiteracy rate that is still high, tackling also the problem of the low level of infrastructure development before thinking about the internet, which has been used widely still, I mean it's developing, being used for educational purposes and other similar. I don't see the government's really concerned by on how to control the internet to prevent an uprising of the kind we had in Egypt and Tunisia. Thank you.
Thank you. Lady at the back, please.
Hi, I'm going to stay seated because I want to read from something here. My name is Rebecca McKinnon. I wear a number of hats. One is I'm a senior fellow at the New America Foundation. I'm also co-founder of a global citizen media community called Global Voices Online, through which since 2005, young people in the Middle East, in Africa, and all around the world have been comparing notes about how lame their leaders are and the extent to which their leading figures do not represent their interests, and have also been comparing notes about the extent to which they feel the Western media has mischaracterized who they are and what they believe and what they want. And I just wanted to share a couple of things that some people from this community have been saying. One is an email I received just yesterday from a young man in Alexandria, Egypt, who is not a well-known blogger, but he was clearly participating in events of the past couple of months. And he said, I just want to let you know that this revolution did not happen suddenly. Mostly it was a revolution based on years of inspiration by people, movements, writing books, speeches, you name it, both national and international. And he goes on to talk about how people have really been connected together in a global network of people who share common values and common frustrations. And he goes on to conclude, let me just, because he talks about what they want. I just want to, I want you to support us because we need your expertise in freedom, in thinking, in democracy, in organizing, etc. We don't need money. We need our hands put together to make a better future for this world, a future with no humiliation, prejudice, injustice, etc. And then he goes on a bit more from there. But that also echoes other things I've been hearing from a number of people in our community over the past year or so. There's a man named Sami Ben Garbia, who's a Tunisian exile, who has been very central, actually, in building an Arabic language platform to support grassroots digital activists around the region. And he wrote a very impassioned blog post last fall about why he wanted governments and companies to kind of stay out of the internet freedom space because they sort of twisted it and that they couldn't be trusted. They had ulterior motives that kind of events from one can cite all kinds of reasons why many of these people trust neither Western governments nor Western companies particularly. And in his blog post, he also quoted, and I'll stop soon, but he also quoted an Egyptian open source programmer and activist named Allah Abdel Fattah, who actually was in jail in 2005 for a bit because of his political activities and online activities, and is one of the people who've been involved with not just a national movement, but a regional community for quite a long time. And he said if the U.S., if people in the United States, U.S. companies and nonprofits want to support democracy in the Middle East, the best they can do is continue to develop a free, neutral, decentralized internet. Fight the troubling trends emerging in your own backyards, from threats to net neutrality, disregard for users' privacy, draconian copyright and digital rights management restrictions, to the troubling trends of censorship through courts in Europe, restrictions on anonymous access, and rampant surveillance in the name of combating terrorism or protecting children or fighting hate speech or whatever. You see, these trends give our own regimes great excuses for their own actions. You don't need special programs and projects to help free the internet in the Middle East. Just keep it free, accessible, and affordable on your side, and we'll figure out how to use it, get around restrictions imposed by our governments, and innovate and contribute to the network's growth. So I just wanted to share those voices from people who've been part of what's happened in the past couple of months.
Thank you. That was very useful. Thank you very much. There's a gentleman here in the front. And perhaps we'll take not all the questions, but about two more, and then after the answers, I think we'll have run out of time.
I'm Reed Kramer from allafrica.com. I wanted to follow your comment, Martin, about Al Jazeera and media storyline, and ask the panelists how they view the intersection between traditional media and new media, and the role in what's been happening and what's moving forward, and how you view that.
There's a question at the back.
Yeah, thank you very much. My name is William Sekanim. I write for My African Channel Television. Apparently, I want to return to your opening statement where you kind of wanted to knock off the relationship between economic factors and what's going on. And if we take our mind back to how the whole thing started in Tunisia, you found out that it was the story of a young man who was trying to earn a living, but somehow he got frustrated by the police, and from there one thing led to another. And only yesterday at a different forum, a professor from Johns Hopkins and also a World Bank executive was referring to food scarcity as a primary cause of all that is happening both in Tunisia and Egypt. So somehow, I don't think we should altogether exonerate economic problems from what's going on, because when people are pushed to the wall, and talking of food, for instance, people don't have means of livelihood as small as it could be, then they make use of, like one of the panelists said, they then make use of any available tool that is available. Thank you so much.
Point well taken. We'll have one last question. The gentleman sitting here in the middle.
Josh Marks from National Endowment for Democracy. I had a question about programs that could work in Africa. Obviously, you don't have the sort of internet or even mobile technology penetration in Africa. If you just take Egypt and compare to DRC, we're going to have elections that could be momentous. And this year, Egypt has 52 times more people connected to the internet, and you only have 10% of people on who have mobile phones if you look at subscriptions. So given sort of the relatively low level, what can you do? I work on projects in about 8 different countries. It seems like sometimes hybrid projects using community radio and maybe mobile phone technology might be a possibility. What are some others as well? It'd be great to hear your suggestions.
Thank you very much. I'll ask our panelists to just give, very unfairly, a 2-minute summation, either taking one of the questions or perhaps just giving your final comments. A number of the questions were actually comments, so we don't need to respond to all of them. But I want to start with Sally, and we can move and finish with Mohammed.
Great, thank you. I just wanted to touch a little bit on the comment that Rebecca made, and I think what we don't want to lose sight of as we talk about the internet and the enabling technologies and perhaps the government responses is that fundamentally this is about people and individuals, and they've demonstrated for centuries a desire to communicate. And the sharing of experiences is really fundamental. And so, I mean, I consider myself an optimist, try to be realistic at the same time. There are challenges, but at the heart of this, the internet reflects the communities. It reflects individuals. And I think it's a really excellent point. And maybe going to your point a little bit about what can we do, it's providing access, fundamentally. People will do things with the technology. People will build applications that make sense in their context and in their environment if they have the opportunity to do it. And so, it's important, and I again, I'm not trying to be naive about the challenges that people face, but I think fundamentally we need to give people the connectivity, give people the access, and let them run with it, so to speak. I also think it's important for countries like the United States and the European Union and others that have very robust internet communities to lead by example, and to be mindful that countries that are learning, countries that are coming online are watching and are learning from their experiences and their policy approaches. And nothing's in a vacuum. Talking about internet freedom on the one hand and undertaking efforts to block on the other in a completely different context are noticed globally because people are communicating, as Rebecca said. So I guess I would come back to the point that this really is about communities. It's about individuals, that the internet reflects them and reflects their fundamental desire to be connected.
Okay. There are several questions that I'd love to respond to. We don't really have time, so I'll try to summarize a little bit. In terms of the question about the internet and openness and participation, we couldn't agree more that that's going to help. I think we would just encourage the international community and everybody involved who chooses to be involved, because there is a good critique about when we should be involved, to think about, as these technologies take place and as they're introduced into less democratic environments, that we need to be cognizant of security and responsible approaches. Tools-driven approaches really aren't very appropriate for most of these environments. Where you sort of sprinkle in some technology and hope something grows, you've got to engage with activists and various civic participants to ensure that they're not putting themselves at risk when they use these tools. And so that's a main message that I think NDI has really learned, and it comes a lot from people like Sammy Ben and others who've raised these important critiques about international involvement and the role of internet freedom, and those debates are extremely important. NDI as an organization didn't really, a year and a half ago, wasn't really deeply involved in these conversations, and we might have been putting people at risk. You just never know in these tough environments what's going on. So it's really important that all the voices are heard. I think there's an important role for international assistance in some cases, and I think Sammy Ben's blog post was widely read in Washington, and it was really an important contribution around that conference in the Middle East, or what was in Europe. But I think the points, I think all the voices are at the table, and I think that there's an important role for democracy assistance, which might lead to the third question, which I was going to try to tie in, which is the question about low infrastructure environments and how to program in that part of the world, in those parts of the world like Congo. Appropriate technologies and sustainable approaches are a necessary component of any of this work. NDI has been doing human rights work and violence work and election monitoring in countries before the internet technologies were there. And so there are approaches that are paper-based and they're very manual. And as these technologies come into the environments, they're gradually adopted. And so there are a whole number of ways that you can build these hybrid programming models with mobile phones, especially in Africa, to begin to leverage the technologies to empower people to get e-commerce going or hold governments accountable for better elections, and still not necessarily overdo it and impose technologies which can't be sustained or supported, or they're inappropriate for that environment. So that
you can see people can text message commentary on shows that they hear off the ground, and so it's just enriched the amount of information. But also in terms of government policy and foreign policy out of the United States, people have, I think, been collaborate between out here and in Africa around the issue of dictator breeding, for lack of a better term, but especially around the issue of security, which was raised, that in the name of security, you have regimes that have been oppressive of their people, receiving support and financing, and these conversations might not normally be that prevalent on CNN or BBC, but you now have fora to blogs and so on and so forth, where I think, once again, the new voices and diversity of analysis has really helped to inform the average person. And of course, new media allows for people to get to be able to disseminate the information more widely. So you don't have to have listened to the news. You can capture it and send a video to your friend, and they can watch it, 10 days later or whenever they have time, and et cetera, et cetera. So I guess you understand what I'm saying. I just wanted to highlight that. Again, social networks exist off the digital space, and that is really where a lot of all this organizing and so on happens, and that's critical before you get to use the digital tools. And these social networks, apart from needing support in the digital world to be able to achieve their ends, need more support, like she read, the lady at the back there read in her comments. They need more support, not just in that digital realm, but they need support from the democratic countries to really walk the talk about democracy. It's very difficult to understand how one can stand up and say they'd like to support democracy, and then at the same time be very afraid when you see democratic forces, genuine democratic forces emerge and say you supporting democracy while at the same time be financing anti-democratic forces elsewhere. So more important than the tools, keeping the tools free, etc., is really being true to an understanding of the dignity that other human beings deserve, and walking that talk. So then it will fall into the digital space as well. If you really appreciate, then it'll cover everything. But are you true to the principles or not? And lastly, on new media, I would say that new media has made people feel empowered. So while before you needed to, it would take much more commitment on one's part to be part of a movement or a democratic movement. It would take much more from an individual. For now, if you just changed your Facebook picture to have "We are all Kareem," you are contributing significantly, though it's small. It's a small contribution. You're contributing something to your entire network that's sitting there. If you just send a video that you saw, you're contributing something more tangible than just your own interpretation of events, word of mouth type stuff. It's new media has had that effect of making people feel more empowered and exactly, it's reduced the threshold for participation, effective participation in these things. I guess that would be my.
Thank you, Mohammed. You have the last word. Make it a short one.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I just want to say about just one point about net saturation. I think just a little bit of internet goes a long way. Tunisia was rated by OpenNet Initiative as the most hostile Arab country to internet freedom just before the revolution, and the third most dangerous country in the world from which to block. So that did not start the revolution. There was some connectivity, but it wasn't easy. In Egypt, internet connectivity is just a little over 20% of the population. So it's not huge, but it did offer enough critical mass for a number of committed enough activists to communicate with each other and rally, of course, through old media as well as traditional social network means a lot around. So it's not as though you need a huge amount of saturation in the country to have to do some kind of social change. You need just a little bit mixed with all traditional kind of media and also traditional kind of needs of social network that are not that are not technology based either. So I have seen that happening. The other thing that is important, of course, about the social networking online and so on and so forth, is that as far as I've been able to see, is that was a way by which people have been able to develop new identities. That is, they were able to discover what connected them to each other in a way that was not preconceived before, in a way that was fairly open, and that did result in the evolution of a new kind of culture preceding the revolution. And that, of course, became the culture of the revolution, the culture of what I call the new patriotism. It is interesting, one way to look at it, or to measure it, or to see that it was visible to the government that had been monitoring the internet, yet the government did not understand it. You can see that when Omar Suleiman, the new vice president of Mubarak, just 1 week before the fall of Mubarak, Omar Suleiman, keep in mind he was the top spy, he was in charge of the intelligence of the country, and was supposed to know everything. And he said that he had been expecting what we call the Facebook revolution for a whole year before the revolution, and he had even estimated its size at 100,000 participants. I'm not sure where he got that number from, and there are various ways to figure out where that number came from, but in any case it was inaccurate. And the even more interesting fact is that he could not describe that revolution with any more precision than a Facebook revolution. He could not describe, for example, the organization that stands behind it. He could not even describe its ideology, or what kind of kept it together. But he was nonetheless expecting some kind of revolution. And out of the new realities that he was observing, and his agent was obviously observing on all kind of sites that they were infiltrating. So one of the things about the network, it makes the kind of activism that results out of the new connectivity hard to predict for the government. Even though the saturation, kind of social saturation of the new media may not be as great as we might like. So perhaps I should just leave it there.
Thank you very much, Mohammed. Let me just thank the panel for giving us their time and their wisdom and knowledge. Thank you so much. And thank you, the audience, for coming to join us here today. This meeting, we're holding it partly for selfish reasons. One is to learn, because we're moving towards writing a report on this particular issue that is specifically in looking at Africa. And so hopefully we'll turn to some of you to perhaps even join us in developing that report together. But thank you so much, and I hope you keep engaged with the Ansari Africa Center. Again, sorry for letting you out later than I had promised, and I wish you a fine afternoon. Thank you.